Griffin. After all these...
At first glance, the Griffin incident looks like Star Trek doing horror. A haunted starship, ghostly apparitions, hallucinations, blood, jump scares. By the end of the episode, it almost feels like Event Horizon crossed with The Shining. But underneath all of that horror is a much more personal story. The Griffin isn't really about ghosts. It's about fear. More specifically, it's about the fears every member of the landing party has spent years trying to bury. The episode wastes no time establishing that something is wrong. Kirk, Lyanne, and Spock aren't responding to a distress call from a living ship. They're investigating a mystery that's been unsolved for nearly a decade. The USS Griffin vanished without explanation, becoming one of Starfleet's greatest unanswered questions. That immediately frames the Griffin less as a location and more as a legend. The crew isn't simply boarding an abandoned vessel. They're walking into a mystery that has already consumed countless theories. The empty corridors reinforce that idea. Nothing appears damaged enough to explain the disappearance. It's as if the crew simply vanished in the middle of ordinary life, creating an unsettling sense that the real threat isn't physical at all. The first major clue arrives when life support suddenly reactivates, despite the ship having only 1 hour of power remaining. From that moment forward, the Griffin behaves almost like it's aware of its visitors. Doors open at exactly the wrong time. Sounds lure crew members away from one another. Hallucinations begin matching the deepest emotional wounds of whoever experiences them. Rather than attacking randomly, the ship seems to understand precisely which memories, regrets, and fears will cause the greatest psychological damage. That's why every vision is so personal. Kirk doesn't encounter generic monsters. He hears his son David crying for help. Earlier in the episode, the audience sees him carrying a toy meant for David, quietly establishing that fatherhood has become one of Kirk's greatest emotional conflicts. He wants to be present in his son's life, yet Starfleet constantly pulls him away. The Griffin weaponizes that guilt, transforming it into a nightmare where David is trapped and Kirk cannot save him. The episode isn't suggesting Kirk fears monsters. He fears becoming the absent father history tells us he eventually becomes. Lyanne's nightmare is completely different because her emotional wounds are completely different. Ever since the alternate timeline events involving another version of James Kirk, she's carried unresolved grief and loneliness while trying to convince herself that Starfleet is enough. Chief Security Officer Rose Harper becomes the perfect instrument to exploit that insecurity. Harper repeatedly tells Lyanne, "You are one of us."
You're one of us.
That line isn't referring to ghosts. It's referring to people consumed by isolation, trauma, and guilt. Harper isn't trying to recruit Lyanne to some supernatural force. She's convincing Lyanne that she's destined to become another broken Starfleet officer whose devotion to duty eventually destroys her. The brilliance of that phrase is that it works on multiple levels. Literally, Harper wants Lyanne to believe she belongs among the Griffin's dead crew. Psychologically, she's attacking Lyanne's deepest fear, that there's something fundamentally broken inside her. Throughout the series, Lyanne has repeatedly struggled to believe she deserves happiness after everything she's endured because of her connection to Khan Noonien Singh. The Griffin doesn't invent those feelings. It amplifies them until she begins accepting them as truth. Spock's experience follows the same pattern. His hallucination isn't random violence. It's T'Pring accusing him of embracing his humanity, while literally cutting away his Vulcan identity. On the surface, it's gruesome body horror. Underneath, it's an expression of the conflict that has defined Spock's entire life. He's always balanced two identities that never seem fully compatible. T'Pring's horrifying transformation of him represents his fear that embracing one side of himself inevitably means destroying the other. The Griffin doesn't force Spock to question who he is. It manifests a question he's been asking himself for years. One of the smartest storytelling choices is that the episode never fully explains the source of these manifestations. Spock initially searches for scientific explanations, suggesting unusual energy or charged particles, while Pike later refers the entire incident to Division 12, Starfleet's branch for phenomena that resist conventional explanation. Rather than solving the mystery, the writers deliberately leave room for uncertainty. Is the Griffin haunted? Is it a psychic entity? Is it an alien lifeform manipulating perception? The episode never answers, and that's precisely why it remains so unsettling. Perhaps the most disturbing moment comes after the apparent rescue. The audience briefly believes the nightmare has ended, only to discover that Pike, Una, Sam Kirk, and the others are themselves part of the hallucination. That twist fundamentally changes how viewers interpret everything that follows. Once reality becomes unreliable, neither the characters nor the audience can confidently distinguish truth from illusion. The Griffin doesn't simply trap people inside a haunted ship. It traps them inside their own perceptions. The final scene involving Rose Harper confirms that the danger hasn't truly disappeared. After the Enterprise departs, Harper silently watches from aboard the Griffin before raising a finger to her lips in a shh gesture. Whether she's a ghost, a psychic echo, or something else entirely remains deliberately ambiguous, but the message is unmistakable. The mystery of the Griffin isn't over. Whatever consumed its crew is still there, waiting for the next visitors. Rather than closing the story, the ending transforms the Griffin into one of the most terrifying unexplained mysteries in Strange New Worlds and lays the groundwork for Division 12 to investigate similar phenomena in the future. Ultimately, the Griffin incident isn't really a ghost story. It's a psychological horror story disguised as science fiction. Every hallucination forces the crew to confront the one fear they've never fully escaped. Kirk faces the possibility of failing his family. Spock confronts the impossible balance between Vulcan logic and human emotion. La'an comes face to face with the terrifying belief that she's destined to end up alone. Just like Harper, the Griffin doesn't create those fears, it exposes them. And that's what makes the episode so effective. The monsters aren't hiding in the shadows of an abandoned starship. They've been living inside the characters all along. But here's the detail I can't stop thinking about, because I believe it's the real purpose of the Griffin. Everyone aboard the ship experiences something different, yet every hallucination follows the same pattern. The entity never attacks its victims with random monsters or meaningless visions. Instead, it carefully studies what each person fears most, and slowly builds a reality around that fear until the victim can't tell where memory ends and illusion begins. That's exactly what happened to Rose Harper 9 years earlier. Her personal logs reveal someone who knew something was terribly wrong but gradually lost the ability to trust her own mind. She wasn't driven insane overnight. The Griffin slowly convinced her that every terrible thought in her head was real. By the time the Enterprise crew arrives, Harper has become less of a victim and more of a warning. Her repeated message, "You are one of us," isn't just meant to frighten Lan. It's a desperate reminder that everyone who stays aboard long enough eventually suffers the same fate. That realization completely changes how we should interpret the ending. Throughout the episode, the crew believes they're trying to solve the mystery of what destroyed the Griffin. By the final act, they discover the ship itself isn't the mystery at all. It's the trap. Whatever force exists aboard the Griffin doesn't need weapons, because it turns the human mind into its battlefield. Look at how quickly the hallucinations escalate. At first, they're subtle sounds and brief glimpses of familiar faces. Then they become conversations. Finally, they become entire realities that feel completely authentic. By the time Pike and the Enterprise rescue team appear, both the audience and the characters desperately want to believe the nightmare is over. That's precisely why the twist works so well. The Griffin understands hope just as well as fear. It gives its victims exactly what they want to see before ripping that certainty away. Once the rescue itself becomes another illusion, the crew loses the one thing every Starfleet officer depends on during a crisis: the ability to trust their own judgment. I also think the episode is quietly introducing something much bigger through Division 12. For years, Star Trek has explained almost every mystery through science, no matter how strange it initially appeared. Here, the writers intentionally refuse to provide that comfort. Pike doesn't solve the Griffin's secret. Spock can't explain it with logic. Even Magala has no medical diagnosis for what happened to Lan and Spock beyond acknowledging that their bodies survived while their minds are still healing. Referring the case to Division 12 feels like the writers opening a completely new chapter for Strange New Worlds. Instead of exploring strange civilizations or unknown technology, Division 12 investigates phenomena that challenge Starfleet's understanding of reality itself. The Griffin may only be the first of many mysteries that cannot simply be solved with a tricorder or a scientific equation. Then there's La'an, who I think leaves this episode more changed than anyone else. Kirk recovers from his injuries. Spock begins reconnecting with himself during his conversation with Chapel, but La'an walks away carrying something much heavier. Harper didn't simply exploit her fear of isolation. She forced La'an to confront the possibility that she's becoming exactly the kind of officer she always feared she might become. Throughout the series, Lan has survived unimaginable trauma, yet she's always managed to channel that pain into discipline and duty. The Griffin attacks the foundation of that identity by suggesting that duty alone cannot save someone from themselves. When Harper whispers, "You are one of us," she's implying that Lan's greatest strength, her willingness to sacrifice everything for Starfleet, could eventually consume her the same way it consumed Harper. That's why Pike chooses not to include the full truth in his official report. He recognizes that not every wound leaves a visible scar. And finally, I think the closing shot tells us everything we need to know about where this story is heading. Harper silently watching the Enterprise depart before raising a finger to her lips isn't simply a horror movie ending designed to unsettle viewers. It's the episode's biggest clue. Whatever exists aboard the Griffin is still there, still waiting, and perhaps still learning. The fact that it allows the Enterprise to leave suggests its goal was never to destroy the landing party. It wanted them to survive. It wanted them to carry the experience back with them. Whether that means the entity feeds on fear, spreads through memory, or simply enjoys watching people question their own reality remains unclear. But one thing is certain. The Griffin incident wasn't just a standalone horror episode. It quietly introduced one of the most unsettling mysteries in modern Star Trek. And if Division 12 returns later this season, I wouldn't be surprised if the Griffin turns out to be only the beginning of a much larger story. One where the greatest threat facing Starfleet isn't an alien empire or a new weapon, but a force capable of turning the crew's own minds against them.